There is a 3 trillion figure that is attached to the AI boom that is hiding, and we might really be underestimating it. It is not the amount that these tech companies have already spent on AI, it is the amount they have committed themselves to spending in the future. Much of it is on data centers, chips, energy, and other infrastructure. And because a lot of these commitments do not immediately show up on the balance sheet, you can look at a company's headline spending and completely miss the scale of the bets it is making. And I think that is something worth talking about. So let's talk about it. A recent Wall Street Journal analysis looked through the filings of 9 major tech companies, including Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, Oracle, Nvidia, Broadcom, SpaceX, and AMD. And the analysis found about 3 trillion in off-balance sheet commitments, mostly related to AI. For comparison, these companies reported around $600 billion in capital expenditure over the past year. So we're talking about commitments that are roughly 5 times the size of the recent capex figure. And I want to be careful here. This does not mean that these companies secretly spent about $3 trillion. No, they did not. These are commitments to future spending and they are disclosed in the company's filings. But as of today, they are not exactly sitting on the balance sheet as liabilities, and that's sort of where I think things get a bit interesting. Let's take Meta's gigantic Hyperon data center project in Louisiana, for instance. This thing is reportedly around the size of 1,700 football fields. And the strange part is that Meta is building it. Meta will be the tenant, and Meta also has commitments to lease it. And yet the data center itself and the $27 billion in debt financing its construction are not sitting on Meta's balance sheet. That is because the facility is owned through joint venture with funds managed by Blue Owl Capital owning the majority stake. Meta is basically committing future cash flows to this infrastructure instead of simply putting the entire construction project on its own balance sheet. Its initial lease commitment is about $12.3 billion. And Meta already disclosed $347 billion in total obligations for leases that haven't even started yet. That is like the difference. The infrastructure and obligation, of course, are real. The money will eventually have to move, but the accounting treatment means that the full economic commitment does not necessarily appear in the headline figures that you're looking at today. The other huge category is purchase commitment. AI data centers need an absurd amount of hardware, GPUs, memory, networking equipment, power infrastructure, and companies do not necessarily wait until they need all of this before securing it. They enter long-term agreements with suppliers to make sure that the hardware and other inputs will be actually available when they need them. Across the companies the journal analyzed, these purchase commitments were around $1.9 trillion. Alphabet alone had about $811 billion in purchase commitments and contractual obligations as of June. And some of these commitments relate to technical infrastructure and energy for data centers. So when we talk about the AI infrastructure raise, we're not just talking about the billions that companies are spending today. We're also talking about huge amounts of capacity that they're committed to buying tomorrow. So here's where I think things get a bit juicy, because there's a very reasonable argument for why companies are doing this. AI demand is growing, computing capacity is scarce, chips are scarce, energy is becoming a constraint. So if you're an Alphabet or a Meta or a Microsoft, you don't exactly have to wait until, say, 2030 to figure out where your data centers and chips are coming from. You want to lock them in now. And if AI continues growing the way these companies expect, these commitments would look very rational. The revenue comes, the infrastructure gets used, the companies make their money back, everybody wins and is happy. But there is another possibility. What if the demand doesn't grow quickly enough? What if AI adoption does not justify all of this capacity? What if the technology changes faster than the infrastructure that companies are building today? What if some of these data centers become economically inefficient? Because the interesting thing about a commitment is that you don't exactly get to walk away just because your assumptions changed. So that's where I think there is a risk. And this is why I don't think this story is a simple big tech is spending too much money on AI. That's a bit too simplistic. I think it's about what happens when you make such gigantic infrastructural commitments based on expectations about the future, because these companies are effectively betting that the AI economy of 2029 or 2030 and beyond will be large enough to absorb all of this infrastructure. And maybe they are right, but we're talking about some gigantic enormous bets here. Alphabet's commitment, for instance, includes energy agreements that extends as far out as 2050 1954? If you ask me, I'll safely say that is a very long time to be making assumptions about what the technology, energy market, and demand computing will look like. There's already a warning sign, however. Wall Street also points out that Alphabet and Amazon recently reported periods of negative free cash flow, which means that their capital spending exceeded the cash generated by their operations. And that is before you start thinking about this additional future commitment. Again, that does not exactly mean these companies are in trouble. I mean, they are some of the largest and most financially powerful companies in the world, but it does show why investors care about this. Because if your commitment keeps growing faster than your ability to generate cash, eventually you have to finance that gap somehow. And that could mean more borrowing, more capital markets activity, more financial structures like the ones we've already seen around AI infrastructure, and potentially more risk being distributed between tech companies, banks, investors, infrastructure owners, and suppliers. Personally, this is the part I find most fascinating about the AI boom. I think we've been looking at AI primarily as a tech play, a tech thing, who is building the best model, who is winning the AI race, who has the best chips, who has the best product, but more and more we're saying there is more than enough capital allocation play here. If you reference a previous video we did on OpenAI data centers, right, you see the infrastructure angles, the energy angles, the financing angles. Ultimately, all these are a bet on future demand. Because before an AI company can make money from millions of people using its models, somebody has to finance the data centers, somebody has to buy the chips, somebody has to secure the electricity, somebody has to build the infrastructure, and somebody has to carry the risk if the assumptions do not work out. So when you hear that big tech spends hundreds of billions of dollars on AI, that is just half of the story. There is another number sitting in the footnotes. I mean, trillions of dollars of future commitment. And I don't think the takeaway should be AI is a bubble. We don't know that. The more interesting question is how much of today's AI boom are these companies already betting on tomorrow's demand? Because if they're right, these commitments could end up looking incredibly smart. But if they're wrong, we're going to have to figure out who ultimately pays for all of that infrastructure. And that to me is sort of what we should all be thinking about. Again, let me know your thoughts and I'll see you in the next one. I hope this makes sense to you as well.